arrogant cop humiliates black veteran at a hardware store. Then the wall of honor falls silent. There is a particular kind of knowledge that lives in the hands, not in textbooks or certification programs or the thin pamphlets that come folded inside packages of equipment. Not in the clean explanatory language of a tutorial or the numbered steps on instruction sheets. It lives in the hands and in the accumulated years behind the hands in the specific memory of problems solved and problems botched and problems solved again differently the second time because the first solution hadn't held. It is the knowledge that comes from actually doing things. From picking up a tool and using it correctly and incorrectly and correctly again until the doing is no longer something you think about, but something you simply are. Otis Bernard Crawford had been doing things with his hands for most of his 69 years. He had learned to do things with his hands because his grandfather had believed with a specific and patient conviction that a man who could not repair what he owned was a man who would always be at the mercy of what he could not afford. His grandfather had not said this as a complaint. He had said it as instruction. And he had backed the instruction with demonstration walking Otis through the repair of a gas range, the replacement of a faucet, the rewiring of a lamp, the setting of a concrete pier for a fence post, the reading of a level, the understanding of how a square worked and why it mattered. These lessons had begun when Otis was 8 years old. They continued until his grandfather died. Then Otis continued them on his own because by that point the knowledge was so deeply lodged in him that continuing it felt less like discipline and more like breathing. He was a careful man. That was the word people who knew him used first before they reached for more elaborate descriptions. Careful. He measured things before cutting them. He read the instructions even when he already knew what they said because he believed that the brief discomfort of redundant information was preferable to the sustained inconvenience of a correctable mistake made in haste. He bought the right fastener for the application instead of approximating because he understood what happened in time to a connection secured by the wrong hardware. He maintained his tools. He did not let drill bits dull past usefulness. He did not keep a level with a cracked vial. He replaced things when they needed replacing and repaired things when repair was the correct choice, and he had learned over 69 years to tell the difference between those two situations with enough accuracy that people around him sometimes asked his opinion before committing to an answer. The care had a history behind it. It had its origins partly in his grandfather's instruction and partly in the years between 1968 and 1972, when Otis Crawford had served 2 tours in Vietnam as an Army combat engineer. He had enlisted at 21 in the summer of 1968 in the way that young men of his generation and his community sometimes enlisted. Not entirely voluntarily, not entirely without a choice, but with the understanding that the draft was operating, and that the enlistment offered at least some degree of agency over where and how he would serve. He had trained at Fort Leonard Wood. He had learned the work of a combat engineer, demolition and construction and route clearance, and the building of things under conditions that actively opposed the building of them. He had shipped out in the fall of 1968 for his first tour. He did not talk about Vietnam often. He never had. Not to his neighbors on Clement Street, not to the men at the Veterans of Foreign Wars post on Anderson Street, most of whom had their own things they did not talk about. He had come home in 1972 with the discharge papers and the ribbons and a precise, detailed understanding of what careful attention to a task could mean in a context where the consequences of inattention were immediate and irreversible. He had come home and built a civilian life with the same patience and precision he had applied to everything else. The facility's maintenance work, the house on Clement Street, the workshop in the garage, the projects that accumulated over decades, and that gave the care somewhere to go. The Silver Star had been awarded for an action during his second tour in the summer of 1971, in a situation involving a collapsed forward position and a route that was not supposed to exist, and a group of men who could not have gotten out without someone who understood both demolition and improvised bridging under fire at night without the equipment the plan had called for. The citation used the language citations use: valor in the face of the enemy, significant contribution to the survival of the unit, conspicuous gallantry. The language was accurate as far as it went. It did not go far enough to capture what it had actually been like, but citation language rarely does, and Otis had never expected it to. He did not talk about the Silver Star. He wore its ribbon on appropriate occasions. He kept the medal itself in a flat box on the shelf above his workbench in his garage in its original presentation case, which he had opened perhaps 6 times in 30 years. He had kept the case on the shelf above the workbench deliberately, not as a display exactly, but as a presence. The shelf was where he kept the things that had weight to them, not physical weight, though some of them had that too, but a different kind. The things that reminded him in a quiet and unceremonious way of what it had cost to be the man who could do the work he did. He did not dwell on these things. He was not given to dwelling. But they were there in the periphery of his attention every time he stood at the workbench, and that was where he wanted them. In Millbrook, in the state of Georgia, in the 44th year of Otis Crawford's adult life in that city, there was a hardware store on Main Street called Hendricks Hardware. It was not a large store by the standards of the chain superstores that had expanded through the region over the past 2 decades. It was about 4,000 square feet, organized in the dense, efficient way of a store that had been operated by someone who understood both space and inventory for a very long time. The aisles were narrow but navigable. The merchandise was arranged with a logic that rewarded familiarity: fasteners by type and then by size within type plumbing, in the back left quadrant near the water heater, components electrical along the right wall, hand tools on the center aisle, power tools behind the center aisle with the blades and accessories on the adjacent shelving. The floor was concrete, polished smooth by decades of foot traffic and treated twice a year with a sealer that gave it a low sheen under the store's overhead lights. It smelled of metal and sawdust and the particular dry mineral smell of hardware stores everywhere, which is one of those smells that means something specific to people who have spent a portion of their lives inside buildings of this kind. Gary Hendricks had owned the store for 31 years. He had bought it from the man who had opened it, a retired contractor named Howard Hendricks, who happened to share Gary's last name purely by the coincidence of regional genealogy, and who had sold it to Gary at a fair price because Gary had worked there through high school and college and had understood the store from the inside in a way that made him the buyer Howard had hoped to find. Gary was 66 now. He was a compact, careful man with wire-rimmed glasses and the dry, cracked hands of someone who built things in his spare time, which he did. He had repaired the store's roof by himself with a helper 2 years after buying it. He had reframed the storage room. He had installed the current shelving system in stages over 5 years, doing 1 aisle at a time when business was slow enough to permit the disruption. He understood the work because he had done the work. This was part of why he and Otis Crawford had understood each other from the beginning. Otis had first walked into Hendricks Hardware 34 years ago. He had been 35 years old, recently settled in Millbrook, after his second posting as a civilian, working in facilities maintenance for a federal installation 60 miles east of the city. He had been looking for hex bolts in a specific size for a workbench he was building in the garage of the house he had just bought on Clement Street. Gary Hendricks had been behind the counter. He had looked at the sketch Otis had made of the joint in question, studied it for a moment, and then walked Otis to the correct section himself and suggested a grade of bolt that Otis had not considered, but that turned out to be the correct choice. They had talked for perhaps 15 minutes about the workbench, about joinery in general, about the particular challenges of building something in a garage, subject to humidity variation. Otis had left with his bolts and a new understanding of moisture barrier finishing for shop furniture. Gary had a new customer who had come back. He had come back. He had come back consistently and steadily for 34 years. He had come back so consistently that his arrival at the store had the quality of a regular fixture of the place, the way certain patrons of certain diners become part of the establishment's furniture. Not in the dismissive sense, but in the sense that their presence is woven into the rhythm of the place and their absence would register as a disruption. Gary knew Otis's projects the way a mechanic knows a long-term customer's car. He knew the ongoing work, the fence Otis had rebuilt 3 years ago, section by section, the kitchen renovation that had occupied the better part of a year, the workshop expansion that had added a 12 by 14 addition to the back of the garage. That addition had required at various stages framing hardware insulation, anchors, vapor barrier clips, a set of rafter ties, 3 different grades of lag screw, and a specific type of hurricane strap that Gary had to order because he didn't keep it in inventory. He had ordered it and called Otis when it arrived. That was how they operated. The store had a store account system. Regular customers who met certain criteria could open a house account, charge their purchases against it, and settle at the end of the month. Otis had held one of these accounts for 22 years. His account number was printed on a small card in his wallet. He used it every visit. His credit record at the store was impeccable, which meant it was unremarkable, which was the correct definition of impeccable in the context of a financial relationship so consistently honored that it had never required attention. There was another thing about the store. At the front near the checkout counter on the wall to the left of the register as you faced it, there was a section that Gary had put up 19 years ago and had maintained every year since. He called it the Wall of Honor. It was a collection of framed photographs of veterans who were customers at Hendricks Hardware, each photo accompanied by a small placard beneath it giving the veteran's name branch and years of service. The frames were identical dark wood 4x6, a simple clean style. The photos were black and white or color depending on what had been available. Some were formal military portraits. Some were personal photos from service years. Some were recent photos of the veteran in civilian life. The wall held 16 photographs. Gary had solicited them individually, going to each veteran himself and asking because he believed the wall should be built with permission, and that permission required the asking. He had asked Otis Crawford 19 years ago. Otis had said he would think about it. Gary said there was no pressure. 3 weeks later, Otis came in with a photograph. It was a formal military portrait from 1971, taken during his second tour in Vietnam when he was 24 years old and held the rank of Staff Sergeant in the United States Army, the Army Combat Engineer Corps. 2 tours, 1968 to 1972. He had worn the photograph in the breast pocket of his field jacket for the 3 days between the time it was taken and the time it was sent home, which was the longest he had kept anything personal on his person in the field, because he had been taught by experience to keep things light. He had never explained this to Gary. He had simply handed Gary the photograph. Gary had framed it himself with the placard beneath it. Staff Sergeant Otis B. Crawford, U.S. Army, 1968 to 1972, and in the upper right corner of the frame's interior visible through the glass, Gary had placed the ribbon of the Silver Star. He had researched the correct ribbon. He had ordered it from a military surplus supplier who dealt in correct insignia. He had positioned it himself and adjusted the matting to show it clearly. He had not told Otis he was going to do this. When Otis came in and saw it, he had looked at it for a long moment without speaking. Then he had looked at Gary. He had not said anything about the ribbon. Neither had Gary. But the placement of that ribbon, its correctness, the care that had been taken to get it right, was something that stayed with Otis in the 19 years since. It stayed with him not as a sentimental memory, but as a piece of evidence about a person's character. Gary Hendricks had taken the time to get it right because he believed getting it right was what the thing required. This was the kind of person Gary was. Otis had understood this about him from the workbench conversation in the first year. The ribbon confirmed it. On the 21st of May, a Tuesday, Otis Crawford drove to Hendricks Hardware. It was a routine trip. He had 3 items on his list written in his careful, compressed handwriting on the back of an envelope he kept in the cup holder of his truck. The list read, shelf bracket heavy-duty 4-inch, replacement hex key set metric, socket wrench extension 3/8-inch drive. He had been working on a shelving installation in his workshop, the new addition at the back of the garage, and the bracket size he had on hand was a 1/4 inch short of what the load would require, and he had learned long ago not to use hardware that was a 1/4 inch short of what the load required. The hex key set was a replacement because he had snapped the 4mm key 2 weeks ago and had been working around the gap ever since, which he found annoying in the focused, specific way he found all avoidable inconveniences annoying. The extension bar was for a socket set he used on his truck. He parked on the side street off Main and walked to the store's entrance. It was 9:40 in the morning. The sky was overcast with the kind of flat white cloud cover that diffuses the light evenly and makes the air feel expectant as though it has not decided yet what to do with the day. There were 3 other vehicles in the small lot. Through the glass door of the store, he could see the familiar interior, the center aisle, the fluorescent overhead lights, the dense, orderly shelving. He went inside. There was a man behind the counter he did not immediately recognize. Young, blonde-haired, with the careful, neutral expression of someone trying to project competence while navigating uncertainty. This was Tyler Brewster. Tyler was 22 years old and had been working at Hendricks Hardware for 6 weeks. He had come to the job from a stint at a garden center, and before that from a year of community college that had not resolved itself into anything definitive yet. Gary Hendricks had hired him because he needed a counterhand and because Tyler had been honest in the interview about what he knew and what he did not know, and Gary had respected the honesty. The list of what Tyler did not know was long as it is for anyone 6 weeks into a job as specific as hardware retail, and Gary had been working through it with him patiently. The store account system had been mentioned. The wall of honor had been pointed out. The names of the regular customers and their habits and histories had not yet been comprehensively covered, because there was a great deal to cover, and 6 weeks was not enough time to cover all of it. Otis acknowledged Tyler with a nod and moved into the store. He did not need help finding things. He had not needed help finding things in this store for 25 years. He went to the back left section first, where the shelf hardware was organized on a pegboard wall, and found the heavy-duty 4-inch brackets in approximately 90 seconds. He took 2. He tucked them under his left arm, which was already holding his keys, and moved toward the center aisle where the hand tools were kept. This was how he shopped. He had always shopped this way. His hands were often full before he reached the register because he thought through his list as he moved and accumulated items as he went, and when his hands were full, he used his pockets. His jacket pockets, typically. He wore a field jacket of the type he had favored since the late 1970s, olive drab substantial with deep outside pockets that could hold a surprising amount of hardware. This was not a strategy. It was a habit formed over 34 years of browsing a hardware store with his hands full. Gary knew it. The long-term employees knew it. It was simply how Otis Crawford shopped in the way that particular people have particular ways of doing things they have done for a long time. He found the socket wrench extension rack on the tool aisle on the 3rd shelf from the bottom where Gary kept the drive accessories. He found the 3/8-inch drive extensions. There were 2 sizes in the bracket. He wanted a 3-inch extension and a 5-inch extension. He took both from their hooks and held one in each hand, comparing them considering the application. The access point on the truck's wheel hub assembly that he was working on was awkward but not deeply recessed. He was fairly certain the 3-inch would handle it. He was not completely certain. He stood there holding both extensions and thinking about this. After approximately 1 minute of consideration, he decided the 3-inch was correct. He placed the 5-inch back on its hook. He put the 3-inch extension in his jacket pocket, left outside pocket, which was where he was keeping items he had decided on, and moved down the aisle to find the hex key set. This was the moment Tyler Brewster, watching from behind the counter, formed an impression. He had seen a man he did not recognize examining items in the tool aisle. He had seen the man put something in his pocket. He had not seen the selection process that preceded it, the comparison of two items, the deliberation, the return of one item to its hook. He had not connected this behavior to anything he knew about the store's regular customers because he did not yet have that knowledge. He had seen a man put a store item in his pocket, and the chain of inference that followed this observation was the chain of inference that the observation itself tends to produce in the absence of any counterweight of knowledge or context. He watched for another moment. Otis was now holding a hex key set, examining the back of the package, reading the size specifications. He put it down. He picked up another one. He put the first one in his jacket pocket. Tyler Brewster picked up the phone behind the counter and called the Millbrook Police Department non-emergency line. He said there was a man in the tool aisle who had been there for a while and appeared to be putting merchandise in his pockets. He gave the store's address. He was calm about it. He did not embellish. He reported what he had observed, which was a man putting things in his pockets, and this was factually accurate as far as his observation went. The gap between what he had observed and what was actually happening was not a gap that his 6 weeks in this store had yet equipped him to fill. He did not go back to find Gary Hendricks. Gary was in the back in the storage area taking inventory of the fastener replenishment that had been delivered that morning. The storage area was perhaps 40 feet from where Otis was standing in the tool aisle. Gary did not know the call had been made. Otis found his hex key set a metric set with the correct size range. T-handle style, which he preferred because the T-handle gave him better torque on the smaller sizes, and put it in his pocket alongside the extension bar. He tucked the shelf brackets more securely under his arm. He was heading toward the socket wrench display now at the end of the tool aisle because he had been thinking as he walked that while he was here, he might as well look at the socket wrench sets again. He had been considering replacing his current 3/8 drive set for several months. The ratchet mechanism on his existing set had developed a slight chatter at the end of the click cycle. It was a minor thing, but a thing he had been aware of the way a person is aware of a small, persistent noise in a well-maintained machine. He was not going to buy a new set today if nothing in the display impressed him. But he was going to look. He looked. He took a 12-piece set in his right hand and opened the case. He took a 14-piece set in his left hand and opened that one too. He was comparing the socket depths and the ratchet head profiles, holding one in each hand, reading the manufacturer specifications off the inside lid of the storage case, turning one set and then the other to check the finish on the drive square. He was doing this when Officer Pete Waller walked through the door of Hendricks Hardware. Pete Waller was 35 years old. He had been with the Millbrook Police Department for 9 years. He was a medium-height man with a heavy build that had been athletic in his 20s and was now carrying the additional weight of a sedentary middle patrol career, too much time in a vehicle, not enough time moving. He had a face that tended toward a particular expression in professional settings, a forward-set alertness that his own colleagues sometimes described as intensity, and that other people sometimes described with other words. He had been in the downtown patrol area for 3 years. He had a reasonable service record, not exceptional, not problematic, the kind of record that produces the word fine when a supervisor is asked to characterize an officer. He had 3 prior citizen complaints on file, 2 of which had been classified as unsubstantiated, and 1 of which had been classified as inconclusive. None had resulted in formal discipline. He did not think about the complaints often. He thought of himself as someone who did his job correctly. The distinction between thinking of oneself as someone who does a job correctly and actually doing a job correctly is one that professions with authority and discretion tend to be imprecise about. Waller had never been asked to examine this distinction carefully. He had been trained, and he had passed the training, and he had been deployed, and he had moved through 9 years of patrol work without an incident that required him to renegotiate his own self-assessment. The prior complaints had been classified in ways that allowed the self-assessment to remain intact. This is not unusual. It is the ordinary arithmetic of a career in which consequences have not yet caught up to patterns. He had received Tyler Brewster's call through the dispatch system. The description was brief. Male, older black in the tool section had been there a while, pocketing items. Waller had been 3 blocks away on a routine patrol loop. He had rerouted to Hendricks Hardware without significant deliberation. A shoplifting call at a hardware store was not a high-priority event. It was not a zero-priority event either. He approached it the way he approached most things, with the settled, forward-set conviction of someone who already has a working hypothesis and is arriving to confirm it. He did not consider in the 3-block drive whether there were alternative explanations for what the caller had described. He did not ask himself whether a hardware store in the downtown commercial district might have regular customers who picked things up as they shopped and settled at the register. He did not ask himself what he did not know. He was 35 years old and 9 years into a career that had not asked him to develop the habit of asking those questions. He arrived at the store with a complete picture already formed. He was arriving to execute a response to that picture. The picture had been given to him by a caller he had not questioned beyond the basics, and the caller had given him a description, and the description had landed in his professional attention the way certain descriptions land, confirming something he was already in some unexamined way prepared to believe. He entered the store and went to the tool aisle. Otis Crawford was still standing at the socket wrench display holding 2 open cases. He had been there for perhaps 4 minutes total. He was not agitated. He was not moving quickly. He was doing what he had driven to the store to do with the focus and patience of a man who takes the selection of tools seriously because he has spent 69 years understanding why it matters. Waller stopped approximately 6 feet away. He said, "Sir." Otis looked up from the socket wrench cases. He registered the uniform, the badge, the posture. He took this in with a quiet, absorptive attention that was characteristic of him in unfamiliar situations. Waller said, "I need you to step over here with me for a moment," Otis said. "What's this about?" Waller said, "I've received a report that you've been taking merchandise and placing it in your pockets." There was a brief interval. Otis set one of the socket wrench cases back in the display rack. He held the other. He was looking at Waller steadily. His expression was not angry. It was not afraid. It was the expression of a man applying a careful and precise assessment to a situation. He said, "I'm shopping." Waller said, "I'm going to need you to empty your pockets." There was a woman in the next aisle over, partially visible through the gap in the shelving, who had gone still at the sound of Waller's voice. There was an older man near the back of the store looking at plumbing supply who had turned. Stores are acoustic environments. Conversations carry. Otis looked at Waller for another moment. Then, without argument, he set the second socket wrench case back in the display rack and reached into his left jacket pocket. He produced the 3-inch socket wrench extension bar. He placed it on the shelf beside him. He reached back in and produced the metric hex key set. He placed that beside the extension bar. He reached into the pocket again and produced his phone. He placed that. He produced his wallet. He placed that. He reached into the right pocket and produced the shelf brackets, which had shifted there when he had been using both hands on the socket wrench cases. He placed them on the shelf. He turned the pockets inside out. Empty. Waller looked at the items on the shelf. The extension bar, the hex key set, the wallet, the phone, the shelf brackets. He said, "These items from the store." Otis said, "The extension, the hex keys, and the brackets are. I'm buying them. The phone and wallet are mine." Waller said, "Can you tell me why you had them in your pocket?" Otis said, "My hands were full." It was a direct and complete answer. It was also the kind of answer that in a certain hearing sounds incomplete, the kind of explanation that is entirely truthful, and that sounds to someone already operating on a particular hypothesis, like a convenient improvisation. Waller was operating on a particular hypothesis. The answer landed inside the hypothesis and was absorbed by it rather than disrupting it. The answer did not change his assessment. It became evidence of evasion instead of evidence of truth. This is one of the ways a bad hypothesis operates. It does not encounter evidence. It consumes it. Waller said, "I'm going to need you to come up to the front with me." Otis said, "I have a store account here." Waller said, "Sir, I'm detaining you on suspicion of shoplifting. I need you to come to the front." These words, said at a normal speaking volume in the acoustic corridor of the tool aisle of a hardware store, carried. The woman in the next aisle had come to the end of the shelving and was visible now standing in the gap between aisles watching. The older man from the plumbing section had moved closer. A man near the back of the center aisle had turned around and was standing with a section of conduit still in his hand, not moving. Otis Crawford picked up his phone and his wallet and put them back in his pockets. He left the store merchandise on the shelf, the extension bar, the hex key set the shelf brackets because taking them back into his possession at this moment would have created a visual narrative he did not want to be part of. He was not afraid. He was not angry in the explosive sense. He was experiencing something else, something quieter and heavier, the particular weight of a situation that is familiar in its outlines, even when the specific details are new. The weight of being known as one thing in a place and then being seen suddenly and publicly as another thing entirely. The weight of 34 years in this store and a store account and 19 years on that wall, and the way none of it seemed to be operating as context in this interaction. He had been in this store 600 times. He was estimating. He had come in roughly once a week in active project seasons, and somewhat less frequently in quiet periods. He had spent the equivalent of weeks of his life in these aisles. He had greeted Gary at this counter and left with bags he had settled against his account, and driven home to Clement Street and done the work the hardware was for. 600 times. Give or take. And none of it was present in this moment for the man standing 6 feet away. None of the 34 years. None of the account. None of the photograph on the wall. It was as though the accumulated history of a life in a place could be negated in an instant by a description over a phone line from a man who had been in the store for 6 weeks. He walked with Waller toward the front of the store. This walk was perhaps 40 feet. It went down the tool aisle and turned left past the electrical section and proceeded toward the checkout counter near the front. It was not a long walk, but a hardware store is a public space, and a man being walked toward the front by a uniformed police officer in a public space is a visible event, and the people in the store were watching. There were 5 customers in the store at that moment, plus Tyler Brewster behind the counter. The 5 customers were the woman who had been in the next aisle, Bernadette Cole, 61 years old, who had been shopping at Hendricks Hardware since she moved to Millbrook 22 years ago, and who recognized Otis Crawford with the recognition that one long-term regular customer has for another. There was the older man from the plumbing section, a retired electrician named Martin Gould, 70 years old, who had lived in Millbrook all his life, and who had been shopping at this store since Gary bought it. There was the man with the conduit whose name was not known to most people in the store. There was a younger man near the front who had been about to select a package of wire staples. There was a woman near the checkout counter who had been next in line to pay. All of them were now watching Otis Crawford walk with Pete Waller toward the front of the store. The quality of that watching was specific. It was not the casual observation of bystanders to an ordinary event. It was the watchfulness of people who understand in their bodies before they have organized the thought that something is wrong with what they are seeing. Several of them knew Otis Crawford by sight, as one knows the face of a person who has been in the same familiar space many times over many years. Several of them had seen the Wall of Honor. Several of them had, in the ordinary way of customers in a small-town hardware store over many years, formed some loose but real understanding of who the regulars were and what their presence in this place meant. The seeing of Otis Crawford being walked to the front of this particular store by a police officer produced in them a specific dissonance, the dissonance of a scene that does not fit what they know of the place and the person. Bernadette Cole moved from where she was standing. She moved not toward the exit and not toward the center aisle, but toward the front wall, the left side, near the checkout counter. because she was not entirely sure what she was going to do yet, but she was moving in the direction of the thing that was happening, because the thing that was happening was wrong in a way she could feel without yet having language for it. She had been shopping in this store for 22 years. She had seen Otis Crawford's photograph on the wall of honor every time she passed through the checkout. She had not organized this into a decision about what to do. She was simply moving the way a person moves when they know something and haven't yet caught up to knowing that they know it. And as Otis Crawford walked past the checkout counter 4 feet from the register, he passed the wall of honor. He did not look at it immediately. He was looking ahead in the measured, controlled way of a man who has decided that composure is the most important thing he has available to him right now, and who is deploying composure the way he would deploy any other tool, deliberately, with understanding of its purpose, with the knowledge that the alternative is worse. But Bernadette Cole had reached the front wall, and she stopped. And she looked at the wall, and she pointed at one particular frame. She said, "That's him." Her voice was not loud. It was clear. It cut through the ambient store noise the way a clear note cuts through background sound, not by volume, but by definition. She said, "That's Otis Crawford." Everyone in the store looked at the wall. The frame was there. The photograph was there. Staff Sergeant Otis B. Crawford, U.S. Army, 1968 to 1972. The photograph of a 24-year-old man in uniform taken in 1971, looking at the camera with the steady, unrevealing expression of someone who has been in a war long enough to understand that composure is not the absence of feeling, but the discipline of it. The silver star ribbon was in the upper right corner of the frame, positioned where Gary Hendricks had placed it 19 years ago when he had framed this photograph himself. The store went quiet. It went quiet the way a room goes quiet when it has understood something. Not the quiet of awkwardness or discomfort alone, but the quiet of collective comprehension. The particular stillness that settles over a group of people who have all in the same instant understood the same thing and are processing it in the way that comprehension, when it arrives, fully formed and somewhat devastating, needs to be processed. With stillness. With a pause that is not empty but full. The younger man near the front did not pick up the wire staples. He stood where he was. The woman at the checkout counter made no move toward her bag or her wallet. The man with the conduit in the aisle behind stood exactly as he had been standing. The person who had been about to come through the front door had opened it and then stopped and was standing half in and half out of the building, reading the room before entering it fully. Tyler Brewster behind the counter was looking at the photograph. He was 22 years old, and he had been at this job for 6 weeks, and he had not been given the full briefing on the Wall of Honor customers yet, and he was understanding in this moment several things simultaneously, and the understanding was landing on him the way understanding of a serious error lands on a person who had only been trying to do his job correctly. He looked at the photograph. He looked at Otis Crawford. He looked at the photograph again. The placard was right there, legible from where he stood. Staff Sergeant Otis B. Crawford, U.S. Army, 1968 to 1972. He had walked past this wall every day for 6 weeks. He had not registered it as carrying information about the people who came through the store. He registered it now. Pete Waller was looking at the wall. He was a man who had walked into this store with a fully formed hypothesis about the situation he was entering, and he had deployed that hypothesis with the confidence of someone who believes the information he has been given is sufficient, and now he was standing in front of evidence that his hypothesis had not accounted for. The evidence had come from a framed photograph on a wall in a hardware store, and it had been pointed out not by a supervisor or a colleague or a commanding officer, but by a 61-year-old woman with a shopping basket who had recognized a face she had seen in this store many times over 22 years. He looked at the photograph. He read the placard. He looked at the ribbon in the corner of the frame. He looked at the man standing beside him, 69 years old, who had walked from the tool aisle to this wall without raising his voice, without arguing, without doing anything other than complying and waiting. The man was the same man in the photograph. Same face, older. Same steadiness in the eyes. The photograph did not prove that Otis had been about to pay. It did not disprove the shoplifting hypothesis on purely logical grounds. But it proved something clearly and without qualification, that this man had a named and honored place in this store, that he had been here long before Tyler Brewster had arrived, and that the photograph and the ribbon and the placard on the wall represented a body of knowledge about this person that Waller had not possessed and had not sought before forming his hypothesis and executing it in public. The man near the front who had been about to pick up wire staples had not moved. He was looking at the wall. The woman at the checkout counter had put her bag down on the counter. Martin Gould, the retired electrician, was standing in the aisle behind Waller and Otis, looking at the photograph with an expression that was not entirely describable, but that had in it something of the quality of a man who is too old to be surprised by very much and has nonetheless been surprised. Otis Crawford looked at his photograph on the wall. He looked at it for a moment. The photograph was 19 years old on that wall. It was 45 years old if you counted from when it was taken. The young man in it wore a uniform he had not worn since 1972. That young man had done things that the citation language had described and not fully described, and that Otis did not speak about in the 34 years since he had come to Millbrook and made a life here. The silver star ribbon in the corner of the frame was correct. Gary had gotten the correct ribbon. Otis had noticed this 19 years ago when he first saw the framed photograph on the wall, and he had not said anything about it because Gary Hendricks already knew that it was correct, and acknowledging it would have required Otis to say something more than he wanted to say about why the correctness of it mattered. He looked at the photograph for a moment. Then he looked at Gary Hendricks. Gary had come through the back of the store. He had heard the quiet, not a sound, but the particular absence of the ambient sounds a running store makes, and he had understood that something had happened in the front. He had come through the storage area door and down the main aisle, and was now standing 10 feet from Waller and Otis and the Wall of Honor. He was taking in the situation, the officer, the expression on Otis's face, the items left on the shelf in the tool aisle that he could see from here, the photograph on the wall that Bernadette Cole was still pointing at with a steady and deliberate hand, the faces of the other customers watching. Gary Hendricks was a 66-year-old man who had owned this store for 31 years, and who had not become the kind of person who spoke a great many words when a few would do. He had learned this over decades of owning a business because he had observed that the people who spoke too many words in situations like this one tended to speak them in the wrong direction, and he did not want to speak in the wrong direction. He looked at Waller. He said, "Pete," one word. Officer Waller had bought things at this store, not often and not in the way of a regular customer, but occasionally because hardware is a thing that people in a town of a certain size tend to buy in the same places, and Gary had put a face to the name at some point in the past few years. Waller looked at Gary. Gary said, "That is Otis Crawford." He paused. Then he said, "He has a store account. He has had one for 22 years. He has never stolen a single thing in 34 years in this store." He paused again. He gestured not dramatically, not with the energy of a man making a performance of a point, but with the specific economical gesture of a man indicating something real in the physical world. He said, "That's his photograph, on the wall. It's been there for 19 years. The silver star ribbon was visible from where they were standing. Gary did not point to it. He did not need to. Waller was quiet. He was looking at the photograph. He was looking at the placard. He was looking at the man standing beside him, 69 years old, who had walked from the tool aisle to this wall without raising his voice, without arguing, without doing anything other than complying and waiting. The woman at the checkout counter made a small sound. Not words. Just a sound that meant something. Martin Gould in the aisle had not moved. Bernadette Cole had lowered her hand. She was looking at Otis with the particular expression of someone who has done what they knew they needed to do and is now waiting to see whether doing it was enough. There is a kind of silence that has a texture to it. The silence in Hendricks Hardware in that moment had a texture. It was not empty or ambient or the ordinary quiet of a store between customers. It was the silence of approximately 8 people in a 4,000-square-foot space on a Tuesday morning, who had all arrived at the same understanding at the same moment and were standing inside that understanding waiting. Otis Crawford had put things in his jacket pocket at Hendricks Hardware for 34 years. That was how he shopped hands-full items in the pocket settled at the register. He had done it so consistently and for so long that it had never once required explanation because the people who knew this store knew him and knew how he moved through it. Gary knew. Every long-term employee of the store had learned it. It was not a secret or a protocol or a special arrangement. It was simply a man who shopped with his hands full and had done so for 34 years in a store where everyone who had been there long enough knew his name and his account number and his photograph on the wall. He had not raised his voice when Waller detained him. He had not argued. He had emptied his pockets with a patience that was not the patience of submission, but the patience of a man who has been around long enough to understand when argument serves a purpose and when it does not. He had been thinking when Waller first spoke to him about the shelf bracket and whether the 4-inch would clear the wall stud without a backing plate. He had been thinking about the socket wrench extension and the angle of approach to the wheel hub. He had been thinking about the afternoon's work and the order of operations for the shelving installation. He had not been thinking about how this looked to someone who did not know him. He had not been thinking about it because he had been in this store for 34 years, and the question of how it looked to someone who did not know him had not been a relevant operational concern for 34 years. He was 69 years old. He had spent 2 tours in Vietnam doing difficult and dangerous work in conditions that required him to remain functional under pressure. He knew what his own composure felt like from the inside. It did not feel like the absence of something. It felt like the presence of something else. Instead, a density, a holding a decision to carry a weight quietly because the alternative was to set it down in a place where it would cause damage. He was carrying it quietly now. He looked at Gary. Gary was looking at him. Gary's face had the quality that faces sometimes have when a person is managing in real time multiple things at once. The situation with Waller, the presence of the other customers, the awareness of what Tyler had done and what Tyler had not known, and what that meant for the conversation that would happen later. And underneath all of that, the simpler and more direct thing which was that one of the people he respected most in the world was standing in his store having been treated as a suspected thief after 34 years of being a trusted customer and friend. Gary said, "Let's get you checked out, Otis." These 5 words contained compressed into them everything that needed to be said about what Otis Crawford was in this store, and had been in this store, and would be in this store. They did not acknowledge the offense directly. They did not make a speech. They moved toward the normal, toward the transaction that Otis had come in to complete with the clear implication that the normal was where things belonged, and that the episode that had just occurred was the departure and not the destination. Otis looked at Gary for another moment. He said, "I left the merchandise in the tool aisle." Gary said, "I'll get it." He went and got it himself. He came back with the socket wrench extension, the hex key set, and the shelf brackets, and he carried them to the counter and set them down. He rang them in himself against Otis's store account and read back the total, and Otis confirmed it and signed and took his bag. Pete Waller during this was standing near the wall of honor. He had not left immediately. He was not doing anything in particular. He was standing in the particular way of a person who has arrived somewhere with a purpose and had the purpose dissolved beneath him and has not yet reorganized around a new one. He was looking at the photograph. He was looking at the placard. He was looking at the ribbon. He released the detention without formality. There was no dramatic statement. There was no apology in that moment. He said something brief and indistinct to Gary, the approximate language of a professional retreat, and he left the store. The door closed behind him. There was a moment after the door closed. The person who had been half inside the front door was now fully inside. The checkout line resolved itself back into a checkout line. The ambient sounds of a running store, The hum of the overhead lights, the distant movement in the back, the small mechanical sounds of inventory and commerce reasserted themselves in the absence of the silence that had held the space for the preceding minutes. Bernadette Cole was the first to speak. She said to Otis, "I'm glad I saw it up there." Otis looked at her. He said, "I know." "Thank you, Bernadette." She nodded once. She went back to her shopping. This was the appropriate thing to do. Martin Gould had come up to the counter area. He set his plumbing supply items on the counter and waited for Gary to finish with Otis. And when Gary was free, he set his items to him. And the two of them spoke briefly about a shut-off valve Gould was replacing in the quiet, practical way that people in hardware stores speak about plumbing. This was also the appropriate thing to do. The appropriate thing after a moment like the one that had just occurred is to allow the store to resume being a store. To allow the man who had been publicly accused to return to the status of a man in a store he has shopped in for 34 years. To allow the weight of the moment to remain in the room without insisting on performing it further. Most of the people present understood this. They resumed their shopping with the particular deliberateness of people who have decided that resuming is the correct form of solidarity. Otis took his bag. He said goodbye to Gary. He said goodbye to Bernadette, who was now in the electrical section. He walked out to his truck. He sat in the truck for a moment before starting it. Not in distress, not in visible emotion, in the particular quiet that follows the expenditure of a sustained effort, the way a person sits still for a moment after a long climb. The overcast sky was the same flat white it had been when he arrived. The parking lot was unchanged. The store behind him was already resuming the business of being a hardware store, which is what it was, which was what it would be when he came back next week. He sat in the particular quiet of a man who has just held something together with patience and will, and who is now resting briefly before driving home to put that patience back to the work it was originally intended for. Then he started the truck and drove home. Gary Hendricks, after the last customer had left that morning, went to the back and had a conversation with Tyler Brewster. He did not fire him. Tyler Brewster was 22 years old and had been at the store for 6 weeks and had made a serious error from a position of genuine ignorance, which is different from making a serious error from a position of knowledge. The difference mattered to Gary. He believed in it. He had also made errors from a position of ignorance early in his career, and the person who had owned the store then had used those errors as instruction, rather than as grounds for dismissal. And Gary had never forgotten this, and had tried in the 31 years he had run his own store to operate with the same understanding. He told Tyler what he had not yet been told. He told him about the store account system in detail, how it worked, who held accounts, the account numbers on file, what they represented about the relationship between the store and those customers. He told him about Otis Crawford specifically, 34 years. 22 years of store account, what that meant in terms of a credit and trust relationship. He told him about Otis's service. He told him about the Wall of Honor, not just as a decorative feature of the store, but as a substantive record of who these people were and what they had done. He told him about the Silver Star and what it was awarded for in general terms, because he believed Tyler needed to understand not just the error he had made, but the specific weight of the person he had reported. This was not to maximize Tyler's guilt. It was to ensure that the correction landed at the correct depth. He told Tyler that the correct first action when he saw something he did not understand was to walk to the back and ask Gary. Not to call the police, to ask Gary. This was not a complex protocol. It did not require a lengthy policy document. It required walking 40 feet and asking a question. Gary made this clear without making it harsh, because Tyler had made the call from a genuine effort to do his job, and harshness in response to genuine effort in the wrong direction tends to produce paralysis rather than correction. Tyler listened. He was not defensive. He was pale in the way that a person is pale when they have understood the full dimension of a mistake. He did not make excuses. He said, "I should have come and asked you first." Gary said yes, now you know. This was the end of the conversation. Tyler went back to work. Gary went back to the front of the store and stood for a moment in front of the Wall of Honor, looking at the photograph of Staff Sergeant Otis B. Crawford. The Silver Star ribbon was in its corner of the frame where he had put it 19 years ago, and where it had been every day since. The placard below was clean and legible. The frame was in good condition. He had been meaning to clean the glass on a few of the frame's dust collected on the glass in the way that dust collects on things that hang on walls and are not frequently touched. He would do that this week. He would clean all 16 frames. He would clean them because it was the correct thing to do, the maintenance that the thing required, and Gary Hendricks was a man who maintained what he had built. He was going to write a letter. He spent that evening writing it. He did not write it quickly. He took his time with it the way he took his time with anything he wanted to say correctly. He wrote it by hand first on a yellow legal pad and revised it twice and then typed it and printed it. It was not a long letter. He was not a man who used many words when few would do. The letter said that Hendricks Hardware was a store that had been honored to serve the Millbrook community for 31 years. It said that on Tuesday, the 21st of May, a longtime customer and friend of the store had been detained on the store's premises by a Millbrook police officer on a report called in by a store employee who was new and had not yet been fully briefed on the store's customer relationships. It said that this customer was Otis Crawford, who had shopped at Hendricks Hardware for 34 years, who held a store account in good standing and whose photograph had been on the store's Wall of Honor for 19 years, representing his service as Staff Sergeant U.S. Army, 1968 to 1972, recipient of the Silver Star for valor in Vietnam. The letter said that the store deeply regretted the circumstances of what had occurred. It said that the employee involved had been retrained on the store's protocols and customer relationships. It said that Otis Crawford had the full respect and gratitude of Hendricks Hardware, as he always had, and as he always would, and that his standing as a customer and friend was as it had always been, unreserved and without condition. Gary signed it with his full name. He taped it to the inside of the store's front door on the glass, where anyone entering the store could read it before they were inside. He left it there for 10 days. He also called Otis that evening. Otis answered on the third ring. "Gary said I want to tell you I'm sorry for what happened in my store today." Otis was quiet for a moment. Then he said Tyler's a young man who didn't know. Gary said he didn't know. He knows now. Otis said, "Good." There was a pause. Gary said, "You coming in on Friday? I got that anchor bolt order and the ones you were waiting on." Otis said, "I'll be there Friday morning." He was there Friday morning. The formal consequences moved at the slower pace that formal consequences move. The Millbrook Veterans of Foreign Wars post on Anderson Street filed a formal complaint with the Millbrook Police Department within 3 days of the incident. The VFW post commander, a man named Raymond Pruitt, who had served in the Gulf War and who had known Otis Crawford for 15 years, wrote the complaint himself. It was a thorough document. It described the incident in detail. It noted Otis Crawford's service record, 2 tours, Silver Star, honorable discharge, and his 34-year record as a customer at Hendricks Hardware. It noted that the detention had occurred in public in front of multiple witnesses in a store where a framed photograph of the man being detained for suspected theft had been displayed on the Wall of Honor for 19 years. It noted that this constituted, in the VFW post's assessment conduct, unbecoming of a police officer, and it requested a formal review and a formal response. The VFW complaint was not a small document. Raymond Pruitt had spent 2 weeks writing it after the review board of the Post had voted unanimously to file. He had included a full account of Otis Crawford's service, the 2 tours, the combat engineer designation, the specific nature of the work that designation involved, the Silver Star citation quoted in full. He had included a timeline of the incident reconstructed from conversations with Otis and with Gary Hendricks and with Bernadette Cole, who had provided a written account of what she had seen and heard. He had included a description of the Wall of Honor and its purpose and the process by which photographs were added to it. He had included the fact that Gary Hendricks had placed the correct silver star ribbon in the frame himself and had maintained the display for 19 years. This was not the complaint noted a display that a person encountered by accident. It was a display created with intention and maintained with care in the public space of a store this officer had patronized. The complaint did not need to say what it implied. The implication was clear. The department reviewed the complaint. The review took 3 weeks. At the end of it, Officer Pete Waller received a formal written reprimand. The reprimand was placed in his personnel file. It cited inadequate investigation prior to detention, failure to utilize available in-store information sources before making a determination, and conduct that did not reflect appropriate professional judgment. It did not cost him his position. It did not result in suspension. A formal reprimand is not the severest consequence available. It is, however, a consequence that is documented and lasting, and it requires a response from the officer indicating that the reprimand has been read and acknowledged. Pete Waller signed the acknowledgement. He did not appeal it. What the reprimand did and did not do was the kind of thing that people in Millbrook who cared about such things argued about afterward, as people in communities argue about whether the response to a wrong is proportionate to the wrong. Some thought the reprimand was insufficient. Some thought it was the correct instrument given what could be proven and documented. Raymond Pruitt thought it was a beginning rather than an ending. He filed the complaint and received the result and documented it in the Post's records and moved on to the next thing that required attention, because a VFW post in a mid-sized city has a great deal that requires attention, and the work of attention is not completed by a single action. Raymond Pruitt called Gary Hendricks after the reprimand was confirmed and told him. Gary thanked him. Then Gary called Otis and told him. Otis said, "All right." Gary said, "Are you all right?" Otis was quiet for a moment. It was the kind of quiet that contains a thought being organized, not the kind that contains reluctance. He said, "I've been all right, I just needed to get those brackets up." He had gotten the brackets up. The shelving in the workshop addition was installed and loaded and level. The socket wrench extension had done what he needed it to do on the truck. The hex key set filled the gap where the 4mm had been, and everything that had needed the 4mm size was no longer waiting. The work was done. The afternoon he had been thinking about standing in the tool aisle while Waller spoke to him had happened, and it had happened the way he had planned it, and the brackets were holding, and the shelf was level, and the truck's wheel hub assembly was properly torqued. This is the thing about a man who builds and repairs things. The work does not wait for the world to sort itself out before it allows itself to be done. It is there in the afternoon, the project waiting on the workbench, the specific sequence of operations that needs to be executed in the right order with the right hardware. A man who builds things goes and does the building. The other things, the formal reprimands and the letters on doors, and the VFW complaints, and the particular weight of standing in a public place and being seen as something you are not. These are real things, and they have their proper weight, and Otis Crawford did not minimize their weight. But he also did not allow their weight to be the only thing. He had the workshop addition. He had the shelf bracket installation. He had the socket wrench set, which he had ended up buying on Friday when he came back for the anchor bolts, because on reflection, the chatter in the ratchet mechanism had been bothering him for long enough. The new set was a good one. He had put his old set on the shelf above the workbench in the section he kept for tools that still had serviceable use left in them, but that he had upgraded past. He might need the old set's sockets at some point. The sockets were fine. It was the ratchet that had the problem, and there was no reason to discard everything, because one component had worn past usefulness. He knew which things to keep and which to let go. This was another thing his grandfather had taught him, and it was a lesson that applied beyond hardware. On the Friday, he returned to the store. Gary met him at the door. Not with ceremony, not with the excessive warmth that is really embarrassment looking for a place to land. With the ordinary warmth of a man greeting someone he has known and respected for 34 years. He said, "Anchor bolts are in the back. Come on." They went to the back. Gary showed him the shipment. Otis checked the sizes and quantities against his list. Everything was right. He took what he needed, and Gary rang it against his account, and they talked for a few minutes about a deck project Gary was considering for the back of his house. A ground-level platform design that presented a specific question about ledger attachment to the house's existing framing. And Otis had an opinion on this, and Gary had a counter-consideration, and they went back and forth on it in the particular way of two men who both understand construction and enjoy the conversation that understanding makes possible. Tyler Brewster watched this from behind the counter. He did not interject. He was learning what it looked like when a store account holder of 22 years came in for a regular order. He was learning what it looked like when two people had the kind of professional and personal mutual regard that 34 years of a shared relationship produces. He was learning that the information in the store, on the walls, in the account system, in the knowledge of the people who had been there long enough to accumulate it was real information, and that his job included learning it, and that learning it was not separate from doing his job correctly, but was the core of doing his job correctly. He was 22 years old. He had made a serious mistake and had been told about it clearly, and had been given the information he needed to not make it again. He would not make it again. Gary believed this, which was why Tyler was still there. Bernadette Cole came into the store that Friday too, not for any reason connected to the events of Tuesday. She was there for wire connectors for an outdoor light fixture she was replacing, and when she saw Otis at the counter, she nodded to him. He nodded back. She went to the electrical section. This was the correct way to conduct a return to normalcy. Not with speeches or tearful acknowledgments, but with the simple, functional resumption of ordinary commerce between people who know each other and are glad to continue knowing each other. She found her wire connectors. She checked out. She said goodbye to Gary and to Otis, and she left. Otis left shortly after. He put his anchor bolts in the bed of his truck and drove home to Clement Street and went into his garage and picked up where he had left off with the anchor work. The concrete had been poured and cured for the footer of a raised storage platform along the back wall of the workshop addition, and the anchor bolts needed to go in while a final skim coat of leveling compound was still workable. He had his timing right. He got the bolts set in the correct positions and let the compound set up around them, and when it was done, he stood back and looked at it, and it was good. The spacing was right. The bolts were plumb. The sill plate would go on cleanly when he came back to it on Monday. He stood in the doorway of the workshop addition and looked at the space. The shelving he had installed was on the right wall, brackets holding load distributed correctly. The workbench was along the left wall, his grandfather's original plank top still in service, refinished twice over the decades. The tools were on the pegboard above the bench, hung in the order. He used them most used closest to the center, specialized items toward the edges. The light was good. He had put in a good fixture when he built the addition, a wide spectrum overhead that eliminated shadows in the corners. The flat box with the silver star was on the shelf above the bench, exactly where it had always been. He had built this space the way you build the things you intend to keep, with care, with the right materials, with attention to the quality of the joints and the accuracy of the level and the correctness of the fastener for the application. It was not a grand space. It was 412 square feet. But it was right. It had been built correctly, and it worked correctly, and it would hold for a long time if he maintained it, which he intended to do. He turned off the light and went inside. There are things that do not leave a person. Not the surface events, not the humiliation of being walked down a store aisle under the assumption of guilt. Not the public quality of it. Not the silence that followed Bernadette Cole's voice and her pointing hand. Not those things specifically. What does not leave a person is the knowledge accumulated over a lifetime of the particular shape that the world sometimes takes around you, the way a space can contain you in two different ways simultaneously, as the person you know yourself to be, and as the person a stranger's assumption has made of you in the space of a few seconds. Otis Crawford had carried this knowledge for 69 years. He had carried it in the Army, where it had a specific texture determined by the specific dynamics of a military institution in 1968 that was not the institution it claimed to be on paper. He had carried it in the years of civilian work after. He had carried it in Millbrook in the ordinary daily negotiations of a black man in a mid-sized southern city, which were sometimes uncomplicated and sometimes not, and which he navigated with the steady, unremarkable competence of a man who has never had the option of being naive about his circumstances, and has also never been willing to be made smaller by them. He carried it still. He would carry it still. This was not defeat. It was the accurate description of an ongoing condition. A man who knows the shape of the world does not cease to know it because the world occasionally forgets to perform itself accurately in his presence. He knew the shape. He had always known it. He was 69 years old, and he was not surprised by it in the way that a man who has been in a war is not surprised by the existence of danger, even though the specific instance of the danger still has weight, still lands with its specific gravity, still costs something. What he had in return for what it cost was this, a workshop addition he had built himself to specification with the correct hardware, a shelving installation that was level and loaded and holding, a store he had shopped in for 34 years and intended to shop in for however many years remained, a photograph on a wall put there by a man who had looked up the correct ribbon and ordered it and placed it in the corner of the frame with care. A store owner who had come from the back and said his name. A woman who had pointed at a wall. These were not small things. They were the kind of things that hold. Not loudly, not with ceremony, but the way a properly set anchor bolt holds without drama reliably for a long time, because the work was done correctly in the first place. He was not a man given to long reflections on the meaning of things. He was a man who built and repaired and maintained, who took satisfaction in a joint that was correctly fitted, and a load that was correctly distributed, and a level line that ran true across the breadth of a shelf. He valued these things for what they were. He did not require them to carry more symbolic weight than they could actually bear. But he knew what Gary Hendricks had done 19 years ago, and on Tuesday morning in the tool aisle, and he knew what Bernadette Cole had done at the Wall of Honor, and he knew what Raymond Pruitt had done at the VFW post on Anderson Street. He knew these things the way you know the things that matter, clearly, specifically, without needing to discuss them at length. He went to sleep that Friday evening with the kind of tiredness that comes from a productive day. The anchor bolts were set. The compound was curing. The new socket wrench set was on the bench. Monday, he would put the sill plate down. The work continued. The Wall of Honor still hangs at the front of Hendricks Hardware on Main Street. Staff Sergeant Otis B. Crawford is still on it. The Silver Star ribbon is still in the corner of the frame. Gary Hendricks still has the store. Tyler Brewster is still there, and he knows the customers now, or he is learning them in the patient way that the accumulation of such knowledge requires one regular face at a time. Otis Crawford still drives to Hendricks Hardware when he needs something. He still shops with his hands full. He still puts things in his jacket pocket. He settles at the register account number at the ready as he has done for 22 years. He will keep doing it. He has always paid. He intends to keep paying. There are 69 years behind him, and a workshop addition at the back of his garage, and a wall in a hardware store where a young man from the Army looks steadily out of a frame with a ribbon in the corner that the owner of the store got right. This is not nothing. None of it is nothing. A man who has carried the weight that Otis Crawford has carried for 69 years and still shows up, still builds, still comes back on Friday for the anchor bolts. That man is not diminished by what happened to him on a Tuesday morning in a tool aisle. He is exactly what he has always been, a careful man, a man who knows the right fastener for the application, a man who measures before cutting and levels before loading and maintains what he has built because he intends it to last. A man who wore a uniform for 4 years and came home and built a life that was his in a city that did not always see him clearly, but that had on the wall of a hardware store a frame with his name on it and a ribbon that said what he had done. He is Otis Bernard Crawford. He shops at Hendricks Hardware. He has been going there for 34 years. He will keep going. Subscribe our channel if these are the stories you come here to find. We will keep telling them. Some things deserve to be said plainly and remembered long after the door closes on the moment that required the saying.